Story 1. It is a bit more obscure, but Évariste Galois was a French mathematician who died at 21 in a duel. At only 21, he laid the groundwork in several fields of abstract algebra. Story 2. Not so much the modern world, but Julius Caesar would have certainly changed the world back then a lot more if he had 10 more years. Story 3. My friend Glenn died when he was 19. He had an incredible tolerance for touching hot things, reaching into hot water, and pulling things out of the oven. I would have liked to see how much heat he could handle as he got older. Story 4. I am going with Harold Godwin's son. If he had lived 10 more years, he presumably would have won the Battle of Hastings and remained King of England. As such, William the Conqueror would not have had that epithet, and the relationship between England and Normandy, and later France in general, would have been very different. England would likely have had closer ties to Scandinavia instead of the rest of the continent, and the English language would have evolved very differently, as it would not have had that French influence. Without William I ruling, there would not have been an avenue for the Plantagenets, which in turn means there would not have been the Wars of the Roses, nor would there have been any Tudors. The union of the crowns between England and Scotland may never have taken place, or perhaps England would have ended up in a union with Denmark or Norway instead. Story 5. John Laurens was a Southerner who wanted to end slavery and believed it had no place in a new country devoted to equality. He was killed in one of the last battles of the American Revolution. While one man could not have fixed it, I would love to know what kind of influence he might have had if he had helped draft the Constitution. Story 6. Abraham Lincoln. Reconstruction would have looked very different. For example, 40 acres and a mule would have been life-changing for thousands, but his successor repealed it. Story 7. One not talked about a lot is James Garfield. Garfield strongly supported African-American civil rights and public education, especially in the South. Had he lived, his presidency might have been a continuation of Reconstruction-era ideals, slowing the rise of Jim Crow laws. He supported funding for black colleges and wanted to expand access to public education in the South, which had been underdeveloped since the Civil War. His untimely death robbed the nation of what could have been a transformative presidency, one that bridged the post-Civil War division and laid the groundwork for a fairer, smarter America. Story 8. Alexander the Great was young when he died, and he would have reshaped the world in significant ways. There is no telling how far his influence would have reached. Story 9. Henry V of England scored a great victory over France at Agincourt and struck a deal with the French king to marry his daughter so that their descendants would rule both realms. Had he lived a few more years, he could have cemented that legacy. Instead, he died of fever. The French went back on the deal, were victorious in the 100 Years' War, and ended England's ambitions in France. Disputes over who was the true king of France continued into the 19th century. Story 10. Genghis Khan. If I recall correctly, it was his death that led the Mongol horde to turn around and go back to Mongolia, as the rituals for the passing of one king and the anointing of the next required it. At the time, the horde was attacking European outposts. Also, he might have been a modern-day Adam. Story 11. Gustav Stresemann was German Chancellor and Foreign Minister following World War I and into the late 1920s. He contributed greatly to European stability after the Great War. To summarize briefly, he was instrumental in re-establishing the German government post-war, restoring peaceful relations with France and Belgium, restarting the German economy by creating a new currency, and redrawing German-French boundaries in the Ruhr, a heavily contested industrial district on the French-German border. He renegotiated and reduced the post-war reparations that Germany was expected to pay to the other powers, and arranged a permanent peace treaty with France. As a German diplomat, he was awarded the Nobel Peace Prize in 1926. Only 8 years after the end of the Great War, a German won the Nobel Peace Prize. Imagine that today, it would be like a close aide to Saddam Hussein winning the Nobel Peace Prize in the mid-1990s. Stresemann died of a stroke in 1929 at the age of 51. It may surprise those unfamiliar with history, but the early 1930s were a critical period for another German political group that might not have risen to power had Stresemann lived another 10 years. Story 12. Fred Hampton was an activist in Chicago who was murdered at the age of 21 by the Federal Bureau of Investigation. They had a file on him since he was 14. He was making significant strides in uniting not only black people but everyone who the government was mistreating. Story 13. I get the feeling the conflict between Israel and Palestine could have ended much better if certain prominent leaders had not been assassinated when they were in power. Story 14. I'm very surprised no one mentioned Mozart. The man was reaching his prime with groundbreaking music before passing away at 35. If Mozart had lived another 10 years, the number of his pieces known around the world would have easily increased tenfold. Story 15. I do not know about the world, but definitely Canada, Jack Layton. Never mind, he would have changed the world for the better. Story 16. If Abraham Lincoln had lived longer, the Reconstruction period in the southern United States could have continued in a more progressive manner. Black communities could have had more political influence, wealth, and stability. The Jim Crow laws, Ku Klux Klan, and Confederate remnants would have had less influence. Maybe. Story 17. Carl Sagan, probably. He would have continued communicating and popularizing science education and science as a more accessible subject overall. Who knows where that would have gone along with the internet's increased accessibility in the late 1990s and 2000s. Space exploration would likely be different. He was a strong advocate for societal health and nuclear disarmament. Story 18. Ada Lovelace for sure. She died at 36 when she was really hitting her stride with computer programming concepts. Just imagine what she could have developed in those extra years, especially since the technology world was starting to boom. Story 19. I remember when Robin Williams died. I was in Boston at the time. Many people lined up to pay their respects at the bench where Williams and Damon sat. People were mourning, writing in chalk all around the bench, leaving flowers and crying. It was one of the most touching displays of grief I have ever seen. The man brought comfort and joy to so many people's lives. He may not have changed the world, but I truly believe if he had 10 more years, he could have helped many more people smile. Lewy body dementia is no joke. Hold your loved ones close, tell people you enjoy their company, and be kind to one another. Story 20. Jack Layton was the leader of the New Democratic Party, which made them the official opposition party at one time in Canada. I believe he would have been one of the best prime ministers for the people, but unfortunately, he was diagnosed with cancer and died. I think many Canadians, especially those on the political left, have daydreams about what Canada could have been under his leadership. Story 21. And Frank died just months before the liberation of Bergen-Belsen. If she had survived those last few months and lived another decade, her first-hand accounts of post-war recovery and reconciliation would have been invaluable. Story 22. Franklin D. Roosevelt living until 1954 would have changed both the world and America, including a very different direction for the Cold War, as Joseph Stalin respected Franklin D. Roosevelt and Franklin D. Roosevelt was not a hardliner versus the Union of Soviet Socialist Republics. Story 23. Maybe not the world, but if Jack Layton, the federal New Democratic Party leader, had not died of cancer, Canada would currently be a much different and better place. Story 24. Harambe. The moment that majestic gorilla was taken from us, the timeline fractured. Since then, we have been living in the darkest timeline. Murder hornets, pandemics, artificial intelligence girlfriends, and somehow another Trump presidency. If he had lived another 10 years, the possibilities would have been endless. World peace, global warming reversed, and flying cars. Instead, Twitter became X, $8 eggs, World War III, a crashing economy, and another once-in-a-lifetime event. Some say he was just a gorilla, but to me, he was the keystone holding together the fabric of reality. Story 25. Mr. Bob Marley significantly changed the world, and given 10 more years, he might have brought about a complete overthrow of the crazy bald head system. This is the opinion of a Bob Marley music-loving older man. Story 26. I cannot tell if his plans for Reconstruction would have been better, but the United States of America would definitely be different, and the world with them certainly would be as well. Story 27. If Ogidi Khan had died a few months later, the Mongols would have taken all of Europe, right up to the English Channel. Instead, they returned home to contest the leadership. Batu had already conquered Hungary, and his scouts had reached Rome. Story 28. This is quite specific, but I would have liked to see Muhammad Ali Jinnah, the founder of Pakistan, live for a few more years. Many of his ideas were for a more secular, democratic Pakistan. His early speeches advocated for a Pakistan where minorities like Christians and Sikhs could live peacefully among Muslims. However, these days minorities are persecuted severely, and the religious lobby has a strong influence on how the government operates. He died a year after Pakistan was formed, and his successor was assassinated 3 years later. I think my country could have looked very different if he had lived 10 more years. As a second answer, Alexander the Great. He was only 32 when he died. Story 29. Senator Paul Wellstone died in a mysterious plane crash. He was among the strongest voices against the Iraq War. This is one of the conspiracy theories I secretly hold on to. Story 30. James Clerk Maxwell. According to Britannica, the concept of electromagnetic radiation originated with Maxwell, and his field equations, based on Michael Faraday's observations of the electric and magnetic lines of force, paved the way for Albert Einstein's special theory of relativity, which established the equivalence of mass and energy. Maxwell's ideas also ushered in the other major innovation of 20th century physics, quantum theory. His description of electromagnetic radiation led to the development, according to classical theory, of the ultimately unsatisfactory law of heat radiation, which prompted Max Planck's formulation of the quantum hypothesis. This theory states that radiant heat energy is emitted only in finite amounts or quanta. The interaction between electromagnetic radiation and matter, integral to Planck's hypothesis, has played a central role in the development of the theory of the structure of atoms and molecules. Maxwell achieved all of this and more but died at 48. The mind boggles at what he could have done with 10 more years. Story 31. Dr. Sun Yat-sen. Reductively, he is the Chinese George Washington, except he faced greater challenges in the modern era, including a larger population, a longer tradition of monarchism, exploitation by imperial powers, and social issues associated with industrialization. He established the framework of modern China, the three principles of the people, which is so foundational that both the People's Republic of China and Taiwan claim him as a founding father. He died relatively young and did not have the opportunity to fully develop or implement his ideas. Regardless of one's views, it is undeniable that China today would be remarkably different if he had lived longer. Story 32. Franklin Delano Roosevelt had just been re-elected to the presidency in 1944, so the United States would have had essentially 4 more years of his New Deal policies. The handling of the end of World War II would have been different. I feel like the nuclear bombs would still have been used, but it would have been different. Story 33. I think if Harvey Milk had not been assassinated and had continued in politics, the lesbian, gay, bisexual, and transgender movement would be decades ahead of where it is right now. Story 34. Jesus would have gotten tired of the whole wandering prophet role, settled down with Mary by the Sea of Galilee, opened a carpentry shop carving wooden fish for tourists, had a couple of children, and reversed his entire teaching about rendering unto Caesar once he started having to pay taxes. Story 35. United States Senator and former prisoner of war John McCain, being one of the few Republicans with enough integrity to stand up to Donald Trump, may have been enough of a catalyst to hold him accountable or at least become the 2024 presidential nominee, thus preventing the authoritarian situation we have now. Story 36. Alexander the Great, just because you are asking for one person. If not, there are many people: Mozart, Alan Turing, Abraham Lincoln, John F. Kennedy, Martin Luther King Jr., and probably many people from the east of the world that I am too ignorant to know about. Story 37. Richard Pryor. I would love to see what a Richard Pryor and George Carlin team-up project would look like. Can we bring them both back and give them a decade to get it done? Story 38. Ruth Bader Ginsburg could have retired in 2021, making things at least slightly less difficult. Martin Luther King Jr. would likely have made even greater progress pushing civil rights and labor rights. Franklin D. Roosevelt would have been the ideal leader to guide the United States into the post-World War II era, building further upon the New Deal. Story 39. Ogidi Khan. The Golden Horde had reached as far as Vienna when Ogidi Khan died. Then they suddenly withdrew from Europe to select a new leader in Mongolia. Had he lived longer, the Mongols would have conquered more of Europe, and modern continental Europeans would have much more Asian ancestry. Story 40. The United States government gained significant advantage from the assassinations of Martin Luther King Jr., Malcolm X, and the killing of Black Panther members. They essentially had to die for America to continue. The focus shifted from talking about freedom to undermining capitalism and ownership dynamics. The Black Panther Party was both feeding and unifying the community while confronting police. That movement could not survive. It would be a fascinating alternate history if Martin Luther King Jr. had lived another 10 years organizing around rent and housing discrimination. If Malcolm X and the Black Panthers had continued unifying communities and combating police brutality, if rent strikes were common as business boycotts are, and if people confronted police attempts to deny their rights with resistance instead of peaceful protest. Instead, we got the CIA-funded crack epidemic and the war on drugs, along with mass incarceration. President Ronald Reagan dismantled state-funded college education, and landlords became highly corporate and largely unchallenged, forming a massive parasitic class in modern life. Story 41. Jack Layton would have become Canada's Prime Minister after Stephen Harper, instead of Justin Trudeau. He was a democratic socialist and would have positioned Canada for success against Donald Trump. We would have socialized dental and prescription coverage for all Canadians by now. He would not have been afraid to start some crown corporations to challenge the major grocery and telecommunications companies and to build housing. We would have made significant progress in addressing climate change. He genuinely cared about regular people. While most of these impacts would have occurred in Canada, they would have also influenced politics elsewhere. Story 42. Jack Layton. I am certain he would have been Canada's next Prime Minister. He was well loved and likely would have changed Canada's trajectory in the world somewhat. Story 43. In the United Kingdom, John Smith was the leader of the opposition for the Labour Party in 1996. His untimely death led to Tony Blair and New Labour, who followed into the war in Iraq, an action Smith would never have agreed to. This was followed by 14 years of Conservative Party mismanagement, austerity measures that caused thousands of deaths, and Brexit. John Smith might have introduced Tony Benn's ideals of socialist labor, and the National Health Service would have been funded over projects like Trident and bank bailouts. I feel deep sadness when I think about where we are today. Story 44. Yitzhak Rabin and Abraham Lincoln are prominent figures. Here is a selection of Kennedy-related individuals ranked by their potential to change the world. Bobby Kennedy, without the Nixon presidency, he might have had the best chance to usher in a new era of American politics. Instead, Richard Nixon became president. John F. Kennedy, without the presidency of Lyndon B. Johnson, the Vietnam War would likely have been very different, raising many unanswered questions. Joseph P. Kennedy Jr., the eldest brother who died in World War II. Joseph P. Kennedy Sr. was preparing him for a political career and only focused on John F. Kennedy after Joseph Jr.'s death. This might have required more than 10 years. Mary Jo Kopech, had she not died at Chappaquiddick, there is a real chance we would have had a second president named Theodore Kennedy. John F. Kennedy Jr. rumors suggested he was considering a run for the New York Senate seat that Hillary Clinton eventually won. He might have needed more than 10 years, but certainly had the potential to significantly change things. Story 45. Fred Hampton was murdered by the Federal Bureau of Investigation and was just as good of an orator as Martin Luther King Jr. Martin Luther King Jr. is another good example as well. Story 46. Vallabhai Patel. If he had lived another 10 years, modern Indian history would be very different. He was the only counterpower to Jawaharlal Nehru, and had almost left the party before Mahatma Gandhi reconciled them. If he had lived, he would most definitely have split the party, as he was never fully comfortable with Nehruvian economics. He would have taken many leaders with him. He basically ran the party. The cult of personality around Nehru would never have happened. Story 47. JFK Jr. He seemingly was on his way to some form of political stature. I always wondered if he would have been groomed to become a presidential candidate. How our country could have been different. We all seemingly hoped for a new Camelot. I'm not thinking Democrat or Republican. He seemed to have that charisma and class that both sides are devoid of now. I met him in New York City and he seemed to be a solid guy. My classmate helped put a cast on his leg just before the plane crash. I used to jokingly blame him for the crash due to a poorly done cast job. I stopped because I noticed it seemed to live in the back of his mind. Story 48. Abraham Lincoln was involved with rebuilding the South after the Civil War. Things could have gone much differently. Story 49. King Henry V defeated the King of France and forced him to sign a treaty promising that at his death, Henry would inherit all of France. Henry died a year later and Charles soon after. Henry's son, Henry VI, inherited the throne at 9 months old. The treaty fell apart immediately. If Henry had lived 10 years longer, he could have established a firm grip on France and unified the kingdoms. Who knows what would have happened in that case? Story 50. Dr. Irving Sigel was a brilliant researcher at Merck who developed early treatments for acquired immunodeficiency syndrome. He was killed in 1988 when Libyan state-sponsored terrorists blew up an airplane while flying from New York to London. If he had lived longer, we might have had some of the treatments we have for human immunodeficiency virus and acquired immunodeficiency syndrome much earlier, and many millions more people might be alive. Story 51. Once the movement for racial justice had started progressing, Martin Luther King Jr. would have shifted his focus to more broadly include social justice and excessive capitalist greed. Story 52. I have always wondered what Wolfgang Amadeus Mozart would have written had he lived longer, and how his work might have evolved or influenced the world of music in a different direction. He was not known for pushing or redefining musical form, but what if? Story 53. Surprised no one mentioned Martin Luther King. He made amazing progress with African Americans and their rights and was a heavy influence. Story 54. Julius Caesar. It's quite possible he would have conquered Parthia in that time, which would have significantly altered the landscape of the Middle East. Story 55. The world is uncertain, but the United States would absolutely not be the disaster it is today if Abraham Lincoln had lived. Andrew Johnson was a terrible president, and his handling of reunification ruined everything. Story 56. Carl Sagan was far ahead of many issues that are harming us today. Although his popularity was likely influenced by the media of his time, he was widely liked and respected as a science communicator similar to David Attenborough. He held strong skeptical views but was not a very polarizing figure. Story 57. Lincoln. Imagine how different things would have been if he had been in charge of Reconstruction instead of that Southern sympathizing Andrew Johnson. Story 58. Abraham Lincoln ensured that the United States would never have to endure Andrew Jackson's problematic presidency. Story 59. Lincoln or Lee. If Lincoln had gotten Reconstruction done right, Lee would have crushed the lost cause before it could start with his focus on being American before being a Southerner first. Give them both 5 extra years, and you may undo a century of harm that occurred in our timeline. Story 60. A lot of American and European-centric answers here, so I am going to add someone from Asia. The Guangxu Emperor, also known as Zhai. He tried to implement reforms in Qing China, including introducing Western education and modernizing the Chinese civil service. However, he was ousted by the Empress Dowager Cixi, who was also his aunt, in 1898. He was placed under house arrest and reforms in China stopped. Then in 1908, Cixi, who had been the de facto ruler of China, was dying. The story goes that she arranged for Guangxu to be murdered so he would not regain power and restart the reforms. The throne then passed to a 3-year-old boy named Puyi. The continued influence of the arch-conservatives in the Qing court, coupled with the ineffectiveness of the government, resulted in the revolution that overthrew imperial rule in China. Of course, this is purely hypothetical, but it is not far-fetched to believe that if Guangxu had regained power, China could have become a constitutional monarchy like Japan. That said, maybe the system was too rotten by then for any significant change to happen. Story 61. Lucius Domitius Aurelianus Rest Orator Orbis. In just 5 short years, he ended 100 years of Roman turmoil, only to be assassinated by the Praetorian Guard. Had he lived longer and fixed more systemic issues, Rome would have lasted longer. Story 62. Albert Einstein, Michelangelo, Leonardo da Vinci, Fernão de Magalhães, Alexander the Great, Philip II of Spain, Baldwin IV of Jerusalem, Yasser Arafat. Story 63. Emperor Aurelian reunited the divided Roman Empire and implemented economic and cultural reforms. However, he was assassinated due to false rumors spread among his officers, leading them to believe he intended to execute them. Story 64. Emperor Friedrich III. If he had lived 10 years longer, I would argue there would not have been a World War I, therefore no Russian Revolution, World War II, Holocaust, Cold War, and so on. Story 65. I'll say Jeff Buckley. He died too young, released only one studio album, had quite the range of sound, and an amazing voice. He could have really shaped the post-grunge scene in the late 1990s, but we will never know. Story 66. Freddie Mercury performing with Queen for another 10 years would have been wonderful. He would have rocked the 90s. Story 67. I'm going to say Jesus of Nazareth. He accomplished a lot in 3 years before being crucified. I cannot imagine what he could have done with another 10. Story 68. Alan Turing's work laid the foundation for modern computing and artificial intelligence. I often wonder how far ahead we would be if he had not been silenced so tragically. Story 69. Positive. Roosevelt. I think he would have helped rebuild the world better than it was. Negative. Adolf Hitler. By default, suppose he wins World War II and lives 10 more years. 50 million people plus more are murdered. The world becomes a very dark place. Story 70. Arthur Tudor. If he lived long enough to have children with Catherine of Aragon, and Henry VIII never became king, history would have turned out quite differently, since England probably would not have broken away from the Catholic Church. So he might not have changed the world as he knew it, but it would change the world as we know it, if that makes sense. Story 71. I realize that someone else must have said this, but the first person who came to mind was Martin Luther King Jr. His death was a great loss for America. Also, for similar reasons, Abraham Lincoln. One could definitely argue about how he would have handled Reconstruction, though. Story 72. William Etheling. If the White Ship had not sunk in 1120, William would have inherited England and Normandy. The Plantagenet dynasty would never have come to the throne, and the entire history of England, and by extension Wales, Scotland, France, and much of Western Europe, would have taken a very different course. Story 73. The first name I thought about is Alexander the Great. I think in 10 years he would have had a son to inherit, someone the generals would swear loyalty to. He would also, in that time frame, have conquered much more land. So we would likely have either one, a Macedonian empire that, through the years it existed, would have created a much more unanimous culture across Eurasia, or two, a current-day empire that united the world. Story 74. John or Bobby Kennedy. No Vietnam War, a true equal rights amendment, a very different civil rights era, no generationally vindictive Republican Party over Nixon getting caught, because Richard Nixon had no chance against Bobby. Who knows what China would be like now if Nixon had not blocked Taiwan in the United Nations. The 1980s would have been very different too. Then would come all the jaded Nixon supporters that populated the second Bush administration, which would not be anything like Cheney and Rumsfeld. The entire world would be changed. Thanks a bunch for sticking around till the end of the video. Remember to subscribe, and until next time, stay awesome and goodbye.